Roundtable, Aftermath, what every CEO should know about rebuilding after ransomware or any serious cybersecurity breach. Today, you're going to learn about how to create resiliency after a ransomware or other malicious attack or even catastrophic IT failure. We are excited to have you join us. We have some fantastic speakers on the panel today, and you're definitely going to want to stay all the way to the end, even if you're watching this as a recording, because we'll be sharing how to take advantage of our free dark web scan offer. So definitely keep on playing all the way to the end, and make sure that you ask questions during that Q&A, and we will follow up and give you lots of good information on how we're going to proceed and how to keep that from happening in the future. So a quick agenda today. Our agenda, we're going to spend about 2 minutes telling you about Vox, and then we're going to jump right into the roundtable discussion, followed by a Q&A session, and then finally, we'll wrap and provide information on the giveaway. And so to just go ahead and get started, let me go ahead and introduce Krista Hollingsworth. She will be our moderator, and she is a network solutions provider partner with Vox. Krista is responsible for aligning Vox's security solutions with our customers' security needs. She is the co-creator of Vox's signature security awareness training as a service and cybersecurity awareness training programs. Next, we've got Eric H. Kong. Eric is the CEO for Consilian, a managed cybersecurity solutions provider established in 2001. He's a technology and business visionary with decades of executive and hands-on experience helping organizations implement risk mitigation strategies that makes business sense. Currently, Eric is guiding his customers on how best to implement security programs to support their compliance requirements, such as the Cybersecurity Model Certification, CMMC, SOC 2, and the California Privacy Rights Act, plus lots more. And then finally, we've got Dan DeSantis. Dan is Director of CISO Advisory and Cisco Security Organization. He has 25 years of experience as a tech founder, chief technology officer, and as a leader working with many of the largest companies in the world. He joined Cisco in 2020 from Focal Point Data Risk, where he co-led efforts across advisory, identity, and cyber workforce development practices. And of course, I'm Jeff Willard, the Vox Business Development Manager and your host for today. A couple of quick housekeeping notes here. I added the little icons. I hope the marketing team is not upset with that. I did match the color though. All participants are automatically muted by the webinar administrator. At the end of the roundtable, there will be time for a Q&A session. But if you've got this, this question bubbling up in your mind as we're talking, go ahead and pop that in the chat box. And Kyle, the man behind the curtain here that's helping us keep everything running smoothly, will follow along, and we'll log those questions and then answer them during the Q&A. So without further ado, we're going to do it. So a little bit about Vox. Organizations turn to Vox when they're under pressure to reduce telecom costs. They're seeking to improve security, productivity, and collaboration for hybrid workers, or are focused on reducing IT complexity of their voice and collaboration systems. We do this using a prescriptive process to understand our client's strategy and align the appropriate technology and solutions to meet their goals. Our purpose is to inspire and enable others to make a difference in the world, both in our own company and through the companies who choose to work with us. We strive to help our customers prosper through our partnership, not just with their organizations, but with technology leaders like Cisco and Consilian, all while providing unique abilities to build and execute solutions that drive results together. And that's my slides. So let me go ahead and pass it over to Krista, and I will close this down for the moment, and then we'll hop back into it here in just a minute.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having us. So I'm your moderator today, and I'm really excited to be here talking to Eric and Dan. You're going to get a lot of actionable information. So whenever we do these webinars, we like to give actionable information to our viewers. So typically when someone calls for security, they call for two reasons. They call us for two reasons. Typically, there's a third-party vendor, maybe their insurance provider, or some outside agency asking them for specific security to fulfill specific security requirements. So, for example, MFA right now, we're getting a lot of calls for MFA projects, or they've already had a breach and they're wondering how to put the company back together. So there's the incident response, which I'm gonna ask our panel some questions about what to do in the middle of having an incident. But then what comes after? And that's really what Aftermath is about. It's what happens at the month after you've already had a breach. How do you put the company back together? And so we're hoping that we're going to give you some valuable information on how to do that. And then maybe if you haven't had a breach yet, you're going to be more proactive. So let's start with our first question. And this is for both Daniel and Eric. It's been our experience that when we talk to a director of IT, as an example, that a lot of what we hear is, we have it covered. This is when we're being proactive. We have it covered. We have all the operational tools. In fact, I just had a call, an insurance provider introduced me to one of his clients who maybe needed some help with penetration testing. And he said, we actually have everything that we need. So if that's the case, I don't believe that people are fibbing about that. If that's the case, why are there so many breaches? Why are we still having organizations getting breached, even though they're doing a lot of the right things? So Daniel, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. This is a big one. And so thanks so much for having me, by the way. It's great to be working with you all again. I'll tell you, our observations have been that where programs, and they fail. The reality is right now, I think some of that conversation you're hearing from certain customers is they're protecting their interests, right? Of course we have it all under control. But the reality is that what we see more often than not is that, by the way, there's probably heavy investment in technologies, is that there isn't equivalent investment in people or process. And there's numerous examples of this where folks are just not building the muscle memory. I used to coach boys basketball, and everybody wanted to be like Steph Curry. They wanted to be no disrespect to LA Lakers fans, but everybody wanted to be like Steph Curry and shoot 3-pointers. And I'm like, well, if you want to shoot 3-pointers, by the way, that's not the way to win basketball. You got to practice outside the arc. It's that simple. And so just like that, with incident response, with responding to breaches, you got to test the program. And you have to get buy-in with all the right stakeholders, the C-levels in the organization. Where we see organizations fall down, and there are organizations falling down, they're not testing at that level. They're not building that muscle memory. And moreover, they're not really working with other C-levels in the organization, other stakeholders, to get them on board. The biggest cause of failure in most organizations is communications. A very simple, hey, we need to write a check to do this, or hey, we need to get a crisis communications announcement out to our partners, our customers, etc. They don't have the process for that, and that's where failure often sort of arises. So I think the other thing I'll add, and I know Eric's got some great thoughts on this, we often see, and especially here at Cisco, we see that technologies aren't fully deployed. So, moving to the technology side of the spectrum, I just had a customer I was talking to the other day. They were running our endpoint technology, and they were disappointed. They were frustrated. And so we kind of drilled into it, and we realized that all they had deployed was the basic configuration of that technology. They hadn't turned on all the features, even though they were licensed to do so. And so that's where partners like we have on the call here can help, by the way. And it's like, listen, if you really want to get the full measure of security, then you need to turn on all these features. They were created for a reason. And so often we see that customers really haven't fully embraced the technology that they have at their disposal, right?
Well, that's really good advice. So muscle memory, using the technology in full, and communication. So, Eric, do you have anything to add to that on why do you think we're seeing failures?
Yeah, and I do, and I thank you for having me join the panel. So it's great to sit down and have this conversation with everybody. There's always a lot of this information. Hopefully, we'll be able to share a lot of thoughts that will be useful for everybody in the audience. So one of the things that we see a lot when we look at security failure is that it's human nature to want to focus in on what you are good at. And very often we see a lot of technology managers, and it goes all the way up to management as well. It's that reluctance to really look at what you're not good at, right? And it's human nature to avert pain. If you have a pain point, you don't want to look at it. You kind of sweep it under the carpet, roll it over, and let's focus on our strong suit. So my advice has always been, if you are not sure, and here's the thing, if you're 100% sure that you're covered, it's a very good indication that you're not. There is no absolutes in the world of securities. I mean, even the largest company gets breached, right? Be it banks or even Fortune 500 companies, everybody gets breached. If you don't know what you don't know, you're in trouble, right? You got to really dig into it. And our advice has always been, look, if you are pretty sure you're locked down pretty good, it's always good to bring in the outside third party to do an assessment. Take a look, get a different set of eyes to look at it. And it goes back to, the wise men, you always find out what they don't know, and it's only going to be able to help you to cover those sore spots. And that's really my biggest thing on failings is disaster always happens with a culmination of compounding errors. Is never a single point. So if you don't know a problem, you can't fix it.
That's very insightful, getting into the human nature aspect of this. So my follow-up question then is, and again, it's for both of you, what about the leadership? Are they involved enough? Do you, in your experience, Eric and Daniel, are they involved enough with the process? I mean, oftentimes they want to leave it to their IT specialists because they are the specialist, and a good leader will delegate responsibility. So I guess my question has two parts. Are they involved enough? And if not, how should they be involved? Eric, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. So, and I'd like to pick up on what Dan had said just now. So here's the thing about the world has changed drastically in the last 10 years or so. Even if you go back in time 10 years, technology used to be the solution everybody focused on for a security problem, right? You have a security problem, you buy technology and put it in place, you run with it. But in this day and age, that's changed. And what Dan had said just now really picks up on it is security really is a combination of technology, people, and processes, right? And then from a management standpoint, you really need to look at it from a risk standpoint and managing this. And you wouldn't want to have just buy technology and throw it at the problem. You can spend a lot of money and not solve the problem. As part of a lot of security awareness training that we do, we teach people that the easiest thing to breach for an outside hacker, for example, is actually the people. Technology is actually much harder to break into compared to the human factor. So, and then the term social engineering all this comes into play. And I really think that from a management standpoint, they need to have a buy-in on understanding what the issues are and address it as a management problem and a risk problem, and not just as a technology problem and hand it off to the technology team. Because you cannot get a technology team to help implement end-to-end solutions and people issues. Because now you talk about HR, you talk about policies, you talk about standards for the corporation. So that's a lot more higher issues than most technology IT directors ready to hand on. And Dan, I'm sure you have a lot on that side of it that you'd love to share with us too.
Yeah, for sure. All good thoughts, Eric. Many years ago when I got my CISSP, one of the things that they talked about in that huge book that I had to read, or maybe I didn't read it, was something about due care. And so that all employees, all executives of an organization own the intellectual property, they own the security of the organization. They have to practice due care. They have this responsibility, sort of a moral code. And that often gets lost in the conversation because, listen, depending on where you are in the business, you're running fast. You're maybe you're the CIO or you're the CTO, and you want to enable the business and move quickly, and because you want to increase profits or whatever the reasons are. And sometimes security is an afterthought to that. And so I think part of it is just the cultural aspects of it. It's just this run fast cultural aspect. I think the other thing that I see, Eric and Krista, is I see a profound language barrier. My team has been in a position to do board briefings. We actually not too long ago briefed the board of an oil and gas company in Australia. And all of the folks on the board didn't speak the language of the CISO. We actually helped a CISO in this situation. They didn't speak the language of risk, and they didn't speak the language of cybersecurity, but they did speak the language of safety. If a pipeline blows up, if a refinery blows up, and there's a human cost, they got that. And so we had to re-swizzle the entire conversation. We put everything in their language. And I think that's a big impediment for many cybersecurity executives and others that are responsible for security in their organizations is that they can't overcome that language barrier. I think it's getting better, and we're seeing a lot more boards now with folks with cybersecurity expertise on them. But there still is, I think, a big impediment there in many organizations that we talk to around what their due care is. And I guess the other thought is that everybody has a responsibility here. One of the other interesting things that we've been seeing over the last 2 years, thank you SolarWinds, thank you Log4j, thank you all the other stuff that's going on that's supposed to be 100-year events, by the way. I think we're getting those now every year. Is this notion of folks are not, again, building their programs to support rapid change. And the folks on the dark web, the bad folks, are starting to take advantage of this, right? We're not as agile as the criminal underground as nation state threat actors, because they're always testing the walls, right? They're always testing the walls. So I think that's a big challenge right now for a lot of organizations is that they have these sort of monolithic processes, these lethargic processes in their organizations, and yet everything is changing so quickly. And we know this from COVID, and we know this from SolarWinds and Log4j and other examples. So, those are some of my thoughts on this. I think there's a lot of really interesting areas to explore on this topic, but I think the biggest challenge that we see is that we've got to find a way to build bridges in organizations and overcome the language barrier.
And it sounds to me also, based on what both of you just said, is that there's this mindset, right? It really is a mindset. There has to be a willingness to learn the language of security, and then also for the security specialist to be able to speak the language of business, to Eric's point about, about the HR policies and about, getting the whole organization involved and what that, what's required there. So just in your opinion, and again, this is for both of you, how do we start that mindset shift for leaders? How do we help them with this? Because, Dan, to your point, it is about being more agile as well, because things are moving so quickly.
Yeah. I think, to follow on Dan's point, the language barrier thing has always been a challenge that people in the IT side has always had that problem, right? Technologists tends to focus in on a lot of acronyms. They look at all these technologies, and it's just that this is a world that is full with acronyms on anywhere in technology. I think one of the things that people needs to learn how to break down, at least on the technology, and especially on the technology manager and a VP of IT or director of IT, really needs to look at this and break this language down into common layman's term and look at it really from. They need to understand that. They need to remember that they are part of the management team. They are process. They need to understand that it's business management as well they're on the technology is part of their tenet of what they're managing. They need to learn how to speak that language. And at the same time, I think on the management level, on the C-suite and the board level, there is a much better understanding today than it was 10 years ago, simply because of all the all the articles in the news, like Log4j and all those issues and all the breaches. Everybody has got a much better understanding. Hey, this is no longer just one of the esoteric technology problem we can brush off to one side. It is a problem that happens every week. I think that gap is closing, but there is still really from my viewpoint, having dealt with a lot of technology management folks, they really need to learn how to just break this down into simple terms in terms of what the business risk. Revenue is always a great way to look at it. Say, hey, we have this kind of a risk. What is the impact to revenue? That is a language that everybody up and down the chain in the management side that understands it. Look at it from a revenue standpoint. Look at it from a downtime standpoint, and that cost usually starts gelling people together and understanding it a little better. Dan, I don't know what other thoughts you have to share on this.
Yeah, sure.
About the mindset. How can we help? Because oftentimes we do see technologists, you can't manage up in that regard. Sometimes they need a lot of help getting their leadership to buy in. So what is it going to take to change the mindset, Dan?
I think there's a lot of aspects to this. It's one of the things that fascinates me most about what we do, honestly. And I think what you were just alluding to there, Krista, is sort of a soft skills development aspect too. I mean, I even see this inside Cisco. We invest heavily in making brilliant engineers and brilliant product specialists. And I'm actually running a program at Cisco now, which is investing in soft skills development, communication strategy, and quite frankly, it's nothing about cybersecurity, although there's some language aspect of it. So I think there's a strong need for education and training at all levels in the organization, because and this is not just again about cybersecurity. This is about how to win friends and influence others. Good old Dale Carnegie. And it's really to sort of build those kinds of relationships in the organizations. I mean, I think there's other aspects of this conversation that have come up for us as well, and it gets back to the do care conversation. It gets back to how do I position cybersecurity efficacy as an enabler for the business. And I've seen a really broad spectrum on this. By the way, fear, uncertainty, and doubt never wins, never works, right? Everybody knows that we're on the brink of a nuclear apocalypse, right? So they're like, okay, whatever, that might happen. I'm not even, I shouldn't even be joking about that. But the reality is that we're now primed for extreme events, unfortunately, and so FUD doesn't work. What does work, though, is convincing business stakeholders that they can be more effective. They can actually drive more business. They can garner mind share. There's a person on my team. She was a deputy CISO of a Fortune 25 company. Her team did a brilliant job inside their company of showing other lines of business that their elevated security posture would actually improve business, because customers, whoever those customers might be, would gravitate towards them and say, hey, listen, they're thinking about the data that I'm sharing with them. They're again considering due care for that data.
Yeah.
I've seen other organizations, last thought on this is that I've seen the trend now with a number of CISOs. There's a couple of customers that I'm working with that kind of stand out in my mind, where they're actually building a brand team around the security executives. And they're trying to sort of elevate the posture and elevate the brand, and in so doing, show the rest of the world, their partners, their customers, etc., that hey, listen, we take this seriously. In one instance, it's a healthcare concern where they're like, yeah, listen, we know we could be ransomed. We know that the nature of ransomware means that our medical systems can go down and we can't do patient care, and there are now real examples of that. And so they don't take the FUD route. They take we take this mission seriously route, and we see it as a way for us to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. I think that's a really important observation that I've seen with some of the more elevated customers.
No, absolutely. And we can go down a rabbit hole on this conversation, but I'm gonna keep us moving forward because it's fascinating. And so Daniel, what should people be doing in the midst of an attack? So I'm just changing gears here. When an attack happens, and we've talked about muscle memory, let's pretend that they do have this muscle memory, that they have been doing the things that they should be doing. What would that look like then in the midst of an attack?
Well, I mean, one of the first things that they do is they establish a primary sort of owner or sponsor point of contact for the mission. And so, during an incident, there needs to be one person who's accountable and responsible.
Mhm.
That person is empowered at the executive level in the organization to make things happen, to communicate to the communications team, to work with the CFO on writing checks if that's necessary, has line of sight and regular cadence of discussions with the CEO and the other C levels in the organization. So that's a really critical thing. What I've often seen, or what we've often seen here, is that there's a lot of chefs in the kitchen.
Mhm.
And so empowering an individual, and obviously you can look at sort of a backup strategy there, but empowering an individual to own that incident response. I mean, it's a crisis, and you're trying to do a couple of different things at the same time. You're trying to get the bad guys out. You're also trying to capture forensic data because you don't know, again, to your earlier point about the rabbit hole, how deep does it go, right? Maybe this is just
Right.
the beginning.
Mhm.
And then finally, so you're doing that. Then also there's all this other interesting thing that's going on in the background, which is you have audit coming to you. By the way, one of the things that we noticed recently was with Log4j, even at Cisco, was
Mhm.
audit teams are like, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? How are we doing? And our InfoSec team was saying, wait a minute, we're not even done dealing with this yet, right? We haven't patched everything that needs to be patched for Log4j. We're working on this.
Mhm.
And so understanding how to manage those communications with folks like auditors is also important. And I think finally, the other thing that I think is really important here is making sure that you have the partnerships in place to support you during this effort, right? And sometimes that's an MDR provider, sometimes that's an incident response, but you have open channels of communication to support you. And you've established, getting back to the muscle memory, you've established that communication plan right out of the gate, so everybody knows where they're supposed to be at the right time. Does that help?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's great. And Eric, I have the same question for you, because in a middle market organization, they may not have a CISO on staff. They might not have. So what does that look like for them?
Right. And that was exactly what I was thinking, and what Dan referred to when he was talking about the processes. And ideally, obviously, even in the mid-market, is we hope that when there's an incident happening or breach in process, that they do have some kind of incident response plan, right? The unfortunate reality in this day and age is that is in the mid-market doesn't exist. A lot of companies do not have an incident response plan. But that said, couple of quick thoughts I want to follow up on what Dan said is that do empower somebody to be the single point of decision making. Do not be afraid to open the checkbook to get the process done. If you're working with incident response team, you're bringing in the specialists and the experts to get the job done. Please do get out of their way. It's a tendency of a lot of companies, if let's say they're working with an insurance company sends in a forensic team or incident response team, they will have a tendency of that, I want to do this and get it done with my guy that I know, and they bring in their own people on top of it. And you ended up basically running over each other. And that's probably one of the worst things you can do, which is a tendency. I've seen that happen a lot in a lot of cases where we're working incident response. Is really let the expert that you have empowered to do this, let them do their job and get out of the way. In a lot of ways. And the other thing is, back to what I've said before, a lot of small business also have a tendency, I don't really, I paid the insurance company to do this. And if the push comes to shove, there are additional expenses that you need to spend, be it on the legal side, sometimes it may be on the PR side, because the insurance company may not cover those costs until afterwards. Do not be afraid to open up your checkbook and get those issues addressed. Because when you're in the middle of an incident, just dealing with the technical, getting the bad guys out of the system is only part of the story. You do have to manage your customer-facing PR side. How you message out on what you're doing is very important. And as I say, being transparent and being upfront, but you do have to control the message, right?
Eric,
legal.
I would just add something really quick there.
Sure.
You called. I'm sorry to interject, but what you just said there about that managing that external aspect of this is something that's coming up in the news. I see this on some of the LinkedIn feeds, and I won't call out any companies' names, but this notion of trust and this notion of transparency. And so, I think what you hit on there is so important in terms of how that business represents itself to the world. And establishing that trust with your customers. So I love what you just said about that. And I've seen some companies fail epically here. In fact, they've been breached and they swept it under the rug and they didn't do anything about it for months because there wasn't a compliance that said they had to. Yet it affected customers, it affected partners. And so I will tell you, based on our observations and what I hear from other security executives, is that there's a lot to be said about establishing trust. Get out there early and say, hey, listen, we know this is an issue, acknowledge the issue, we're working through the issue, and here's our sort of steps to talk with us on this matter.
So this is a great segue then to talking about aftermath. What happens the month after? Because studies show, the IBM has a great study that talks about some of the long tail costs associated with the breach. So there's the breach, and you're going to have some downtime, and you're going to have, to pay, open up the checkbook, as both of you have already discussed. But then, to Dan's point, there's this loss of trust, and you can lose customers in the immediate and then also in the long term. So, Eric, how does an organization begin to rebuild their resilience and trust? What should they be thinking about a month after something has happened?
It's the obvious items that most companies look at is if you are dealing with insurance companies, there's a very good chance that they're brought in on forensic team. They're going to give you some kind of forensic report and an aftermath report on the technical what happens. One thing is it's good to focus in on that as fixes that you need to address. But I think from a larger viewpoint, from a management standpoint, you really need to look at, and go back to what we started talking about, the process is that you've got to look at where your real shortfalls within the organization is. You got to, bring in an assessment team, bring in an external assessment, do a top-down assessment. And I don't mean just looking at the technology, look at the people, look at the people training, look at the processes. Do you have adequate processes or programs or sub-programs to cover everything from vulnerability scanning to employees training to vendor assessment? I mean, don't forget, a very large part of the risk profile that we're talking about nowadays is that the breach may not happen within your organization. It may happen with third party. I mean, there's a couple of, again, I don't want to point out any news, any particular companies, but in the last few weeks, we've heard news where breach are actually occurring at the vendors and service provider level, right? I mean, it becomes very important even on the mid-market space that we need to look at how our vendors are doing in terms of their security, right? They have to assess the vendor, and they have to have a way of managing their risk. So, in a high level, my number one recommendation is go back and look at the organization top down, do an assessment, find out where your shortfalls are, and then address it from that standpoint. You can throw technology pieces at it, you can throw band-aids at it, but it is going to end up band-aid. You really need to approach it from a top-down overall perspective.
And one of the things that Consilian does do is, in the midst of an assessment, you do a management assessment to make sure that does management really understand what's going on with IT and with the technology. And oftentimes they're very surprised.
Yeah, it's that is very true, and it is one of the things that we do different from a lot of other companies who goes in and do an assessment. Is most company assessment goes in focusing on the technology and IT focus. Is you have to really look at your management side of it and doing interviews and find out what they do understand. What we find very often is what management perception of what's being done versus reality, what's happening on the ground, are very different. There is a very big disconnect about the actuality of that, and they have to some way find a way to breach that and come to the middle and make sure they're on the same page. I'm sure Dan has seen that. Can you share some thoughts on that in regards to the mid-market space? I mean, it's a little different a lot of times when you get into the enterprise space, but in the mid-market space, there's a big disconnect.
Well, actually, this leads perfectly. You guys are doing my job for me, actually, because this leads right into the next question that I wanted to ask Dan about security resilience at Cisco. And they have, I think, one of the best definitions for resilience. I'm just going to read it. So it's the ability to protect the integrity of every aspect of the business to withstand unpredictable threats or changes and then emerge stronger. So how does a middle market, to parrot what Eric just said, how does a middle market organization then approach resilience from this perspective?
Yeah. So I agree wholeheartedly that you need to assess the program.
Mhm.
And this is completely irrespective of the size of your company. And so understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are and having that blueprint is absolutely essential. And if you're whoever you are in the organization, you own security, whether you're the CISO, you're a director of IT, et cetera, the CIO. In some instances, that the CIO wears multiple hats.
Mhm.
You need that blueprint. You need, and by the way, you need to show other leaders that, hey, listen, we've thought about this. We know where we're exposed. We know where our weaknesses are, and these are areas of investment for us to focus. Getting back to the resiliency topic. But I also think you need to look at the ripple effect of being resilient. So let me give you an example of this. We were actually recently consulting a large, not a large, but a mid-market healthcare concern. I would describe them as an EPHI exchange. So they service some of the largest healthcare concerns in the United States. Again, very small company, relatively speaking. I think no more than 1,000 employees. But they are arbiters of a massive amount of EPHI, electronic patient healthcare information,
Mhm.
and they're working for some of these big healthcare concerns. Their business is absolutely dependent upon their ability to maintain the resiliency of that infrastructure.
Mhm.
And any threat to that infrastructure has a couple of different implications. First of all, it would completely potentially destroy their relationships with some of these major folks. I mean, these are like the Mayos, the Cleveland Clinics, the Johns Hopkins of the world, and even some of the healthcare concerns. I mean, insurers. But moreover, if that information is compromised and redistributed on the dark web. By the way, I want a dark web assessment. Can I sign up for that? Because I
Yeah.
heard that at the beginning. I'd like one. So just put me down. But seriously though, but that information is, we all know that EPHI, and this is just a healthcare example, I mean, is lucrative business, right?
Mhm.
And so I think the other thing I would say is that don't let victim fatigue affect your organization across the board, because odds are you're going to deal with an event, whether it's a breach or ransomware, and your systems are completely bricked. Is debatable, but you're gonna deal with something in your organization. So you have to make sure that you're going back at a regular cadence and you're reminding leadership, getting back to the testing, right?
Mhm.
It's like, this is what happened to us. And by the way, get the pulse level up, make them sweat a little bit, make them kind of feel the moment and say, okay, here's what will really happen if we're compromised. And
Sure.
this healthcare example is a good example. We're going to lose, and again, this is fictional on some level, but we're going to lose Mayo, we're going to lose Cleveland Clinic, we're using Johns Hopkins, or we're
Sure.
going to lose Anthem as our customers. What does that mean to you as the business owner if we lose those accounts? Because
Sure.
right now, last thought, right now, the top thing we're talking to CISOs about is third-party risk, supply chain risk, and so a lot of mid-market companies have a profound impact on the supply chain and are considered third parties, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. So Dan, before I move on, what is victim fatigue?
victim fatigue is sort of like this notion of, okay, well, we got hit and we paid all these damages and we invested in all this technology and we remediated. Oh, by the way, maybe we were litigated and we were deposed, which that's a bar conversation, by the way, but that's a real conversation that's tough. And I've seen lots of security executives have deep scars from that experience. Victim fatigue is it's almost like the situation of it's out of sight, out of mind. It's like, okay, well, I'm so tired of talking about this. It was like back in 2016 when we got breached, and we're better now. We spent a lot of money. Let's just kind of move on and run the business, right?
Yeah.
You can't forget. You
Yeah.
can't forget.
You have to keep. It's a marathon, right? An
Right.
ultra marathon. Ultra marathoners at
There you go.
mile 26, that's when you get people cheering you
Absolutely.
on. So,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Eric, one of the questions that will often come up, I think, is how much should organizations be investing in their security program and their security technology? Can you give us some?
Yeah, I definitely want to jump into that. I just find it interesting that so much of an analogy that Dan used is, it's like, let's make sure they know what they're doing, make them sweat a little bit, and then and you have to keep practicing. It goes back into, got to think about this like a fitness program or like sports, right? And which is actually one of the reasons why Consilient's security program is called CyberFit. We have a program called CyberFit, and that's this whole analogy taking up what Dan was talking about. Is we want companies to really think of this as fitness. It's like human fitness, right? It's really cybersecurity fitness, because it's not a do it once and it's done. It's never going to be done. You have to be maintained. It's like getting in shape. Once you get in shape, if you don't maintain it, it will decline. If you don't continuously going back in and look at it, it will fall. It will have fault. It will have gaps, and you've got to continually strive to then, to continue to maintain that level, or maybe even take it up to the next level. That's really what makes a security program successful. It's not a linear thing. It's a circular. And if you look at it from a graph standpoint, it's a circular thing, right? You have to lift, you have to start, you have to build, and then you have to maintain as a continuous cycle. So that said, one of the things that the question got brought up a lot is a lot of mid-market, especially in the mid-market space, is how much is this going to cost me? And my set has always been, if you want to take a broad stroke approach to this, I'll try to throw one up there, and then generally it comes down to it, how much a program spends and how much you're going to take you to build it, really depending on the business requirement. And every business in compliance requirements is going to have a slightly different scenario. Generally speaking, we've traditionally looked at IT spend should be somewhere between 0.5 to 2% of a company revenue for mid-market space. The terrible part is that we don't find a lot of companies spending that much, especially in mid-market space, in terms of technology. Now, as far as security, generally ends up taking 10 to 15% of your IT spend. It's going to end up being the security portion of it. And given that the mid-market spaces still really get on a solid footing in terms of what they really need to do on a security, a lot of companies don't look at it from a technology standpoint. Is you got to layer in your HR side of it from user training and a process and procedure. And process and procedure is like anything else. You built it, you deploy it. You still need to have somebody to come assess it to make sure it is being followed up on. Now, it's a little easier on some environment like CMMC, for example, that Jeff had mentioned, cybersecurity maturity model certification by the federal government. That's going to require you to continuously assess it, because it is going to be every 3 years you have to get reassessed. Or if you're doing SOC 2 Type 2, you're going to have to continuously look at this on an ongoing basis to make sure you're staying in compliance. If you build a set of programs, build a set of policies and standards, and say hand it off, say, this is what you need to do, and you never look at it again, that's just paperwork. It will not actually, it will not actually help in the long run.
So I guess the long and the short of it is that it's not a one and done, right? The investment is going to be continual, and it should be a portion of whatever you're spending on IT or on total revenue. So I know that's not a straight answer. Whenever you talk to somebody in technology, the answer is usually it depends. It depends.
And it's unfortunately it's an answer that a lot of management do not like. I say, well, it depends. What it depends on? Well, it depends on what we find after we do your assessment, and then we can give you a little bit of idea. It's almost impossible to come in this first meeting and say that this is how much you're going to spend. You really have to look at the assessment, look at your current posture versus where you want to go to establish that cost.
So I think we have time for one more quick question, and it's one that comes up often. I'm going to throw it to Dan first. Is cloud more secure?
All right. So I want to just say one thing here real quick about what Eric just said. How many folks would buy a car without brakes?
That's a good one. I like that.
Would anybody buy a car without brakes? So I think what Eric is saying, and what we're really trying to affect change in here with all the other stakeholders outside of cybersecurity is that no, you don't buy a car without brakes. You don't build a race car without brakes. It needs to be an integral part of the process. If you develop an application, you build security in from the left. You start at the left. You don't shift left. You start at the left. And that should be a part of the construct of developing an application or building a program, period.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be thought of as a separate mission. It's part of the mission. So the cloud is more secure. The cloud is more elastic. The cloud is more adaptable. So the good news is that for many organizations who are leaning heavily into the cloud is, again, this comes back to change control, people, process, etc. Is that the cloud will allow you to ratchet up your security controls quickly, right? You can deploy a patch more quickly, and you can put the onus on your cloud provider to do that for you, which is part of that is shifting risk, which is another interesting conversation, by the way. But the tools are there to make it more effective and more responsive to the implementation of security controls. You still have to have the cultural ethos to do that, right? And so, okay, well, it's a lot harder in our old crunchy data center because we have to do all these move, add, change controls or whatever. In the cloud, it's a lot faster if we want it. But here's the thing: is you gotta want it.
Yeah.
You gotta want it. So it's all there. All the security controls are there. You just need to be able to make sure that all the application owners and all the lines of business are like, listen, the cloud will allow us to implement this patch or this security control or what have you, whatever it may be. I need to make sure that you have buy-in to do that because they can do it lickety split. Whereas back in the dark ages in our old data centers, it was a lot slower to build that process out, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Eric, and what your thoughts are on that?
No, I think I completely agree with you. It's like all the cloud by nature by itself is not any more secure or less secure than your infrastructure. All the tools are there, but people is going to want to use it and do use it, because you can have all the tools in place. If you don't configure it, you don't have a process to control it, it's still not going to be any more secure than just buying a server and plugging it into the internet, right? It's no different.
I think a lot of organizations feel the cloud is, to your point earlier, Dan, about, spreading the risk. And so, that it's some kind of panacea. It's like, oh, we'll just move our whole infrastructure into the cloud and then I won't have to think about it anymore. And it will be taken care of.
If only that weren't the case.
Yeah.
I would like to, add to the Quenz that it's the people should look at cloud as an extension of their infrastructure. It's not a replacement. It's not handing it off to somebody to deal with. The service provider is basically providing you with a platform. What you do within it is really a big sandbox. How you build your sandcastle in your sandbox is still completely up to you and the organization and how you run it. So that's one of the key part that I think most people should take away from the whole cloud versus internal infrastructure.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that, Eric. I think, again, the good news here is that getting back to my first point, which is it's elastic and adaptable. I mean, think about, again, the old school way of doing things. If I wanted to do additional segmentation in my data center for whatever the use case is, back in the old ages, I'd buy another firewall, I'd put another, sort of hardware-based firewall in the environment. Now, arguably, you can do virtualized firewalls now. But even that process, all I have to do now is quite frankly difficult. All I have to do now is call up Amazon, call up Microsoft, say, listen, this particular environment, we want to segment, we want to spin up this firewall, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, which vendor do you want to use? You want to use Cisco? Do you want to use, company XYZ? Let's spin that firewall up. I mean, that literally is a flip of a switch.
Mm-hmm.
But all of to your point, what we haven't necessarily progressed necessarily here is this notion of, okay, all of the processes that are required to support that, even though the switch can be flipped faster, we got to make sure everything is in place to sort of embrace that notion.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that might be the subject of our next panel discussion, is maybe on cloud security and what that looks like, and should you move everything into the cloud, and what are some of the pros and cons. Thanks for that. That makes our job a lot easier. Jeff, let's get on that. That's going to be our next one. This was fantastic. Thank you guys so much for your insight, your expertise, and your time. It was it was a lively discussion. It was great. Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, always a good time. Happy to be here.
Well, great. Let's see. Did we let me check and see if we've got any questions that are coming up. Kyle, just let me know. I'm scanning. It doesn't look like we have any questions right this moment. So let me go ahead and share my screen again, and I will go over the offer, and we'll see if any questions pop in.
I did like Armando's smiley face, just for what it's worth. I mean, we got a smiley face from Armando, so thanks for that smiley face. Appreciate it.
That's what we need especially where I am. It's rainy day. It's gray. It's nice to have a nice smiling face here.
Yeah.
To go. All right. So hopefully I am sharing the right screen. And let me just pull it up here. Here we go. So this is our offer, and thank you for everyone attending. We will be reaching out to each of the people who registered for today's event and getting them signed up for our free dark web scan. Not only are you going to see, what credentials are on the dark web, but it really helps you understand your level of cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene is incredibly important, for numerous reasons, including the fact that 85% of the breaches include a human element in that. So if you've got people in your organization that don't have good password hygiene, you don't need to raise your hand if you're the same person that uses all your passwords for everything. But we know that happens. I may be guilty of it for certain things as well. But using that same passwords for work and personal devices, now that there's a lot more people working from home, you've got a really big security problem there. And it's always better to know about those problems ahead of time. So go ahead and just get yourself ready. It's going to be a reach out. I'll give you guys a call. It's a $500 value, and just make sure that we're spending the time. Krista and her team will be involved in it and just asking some questions so that we can go through and again do that scan and then provide some remediation risks on that as well. And that is the end of our deck. Let me see. Get back to my screen to see if we have any questions pop up. Okay, put one in the presenter chat. Let's see, where is it? Where is my chat?
I think that's one out there.
Oh, okay. Let's see. What is the difference between a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing? Either of you, anybody but me can probably answer that.
I'll take a stab at that, because that is actually one of the questions that get thrown at me quite often. So the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, from a layman's standpoint, it's very similar, but it's very distinctively different. Vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scanning, which you hear about, is mostly a lot of times used internally to scan every devices within your environment to find out what's not patched, what's got firmware vulnerabilities, what's not up to date. We refer to what called CVE, common vulnerability that is known, published on public databases, and they can be anything from a patch on Windows that is not applied, or a firmware on a networking device that has not been updated, a common vulnerability update. That's usually what vulnerability assessment will look at from those standpoint. Penetration testing is different. Penetration testing is much more active, and a lot of time it's really used towards from external coming in, but a lot of time it can be done internally as well to go break into a system using the known vulnerability. So from that standpoint, really, the big difference is, think of common vulnerability assessment as something that's more static, scan, found the existing vulnerabilities. And then the penetration testing, a lot of times using the vulnerabilities to do an active penetration or breaking in. It can be just as simple as leveraging a known vulnerability and just see if you can pop a hole, and all the way to if you have a penetration test with a team, you can actually have them engage them to go all the way in and see if they can actually copy data out. How extensive that goes it varies quite a bit. So that's really the big difference. They serve very different purposes in terms of how you manage security. Dan, I'm gonna throw this at you.
I mean, pretty much what you said. Just the easiest way I think to think about it is that think about red teams or pen tests as a threat that has exploited a vulnerability and penetrated the network. Right, so a threat that's exploited a vulnerability that's penetrated the network. Not all vulnerabilities are exploited. You're just it's exposure, and there's different levels of vulnerability, and this is a part of your risk strategy. Is some vulnerabilities are higher risk, others are not. One of the things we talk to a lot of customers about is have a service catalog, have a dependency mapping. What apps are you running? What data are you running? Are you running Log4j? Are you running Shell for what the new one, Shell for something? I need one of my Intel guys here to help me with this, but there's another good fun exploit out there. But the reality is that what's the likelihood that an exploit is going to go after a vulnerability and cause compromise? And I think the reason why you do pen testing, the reason why folks like Eric can help you with that is because you want to test the walls. You want to see where the weaknesses are. And by the way, if somebody exploits that weakness, what do they get access to? They get access to that EPHI that I mentioned earlier. Or do they just take down, not that listen, we don't want anybody to exploit us, but it all comes back to, and this is the conversation that happens upstairs, is what's the level of exposure? What's the level of risk to the organization? And will this impact my business resiliency, right? So, but I like what Eric said.
Absolutely.
Any other questions?
No other questions right now. It looks like, so I think we've got a few minutes early, so we'll cut people loose, get some time back. Krista, Dan, Eric, I thought it was a great conversation today. I'm sure that there's going to be lots of other conversations that I'll have in my follow-up calls, but I really appreciate your time today and sharing that information. I know our attendees will get a lot out of this information.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Dan?
Great pleasure, Eric. It's good to see you again. Next time I want to use my music button. I got a music button here. I want to play some music for everybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cue it up.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Good to see you.